This week, we'll be discussing the 2012 publication by the New Leadership Alliance for Student Learning and Accountability, Committing to Quality, Guidelines for Assessment and Accountability in Higher Education. Over the past week, members of the Chicago Area Assessment Group have read this document and sent in questions. Today, we have the privilege of talking to David Paris, who may be able to address some of CAAG's questions. David C. Paris is
Like
the
city.
exactly okay is the executive director of the New Leadership Alliance for Students Learning and Accountability. Before the alliance, Dr. Paris worked on a number of projects as senior fellow at AACNU and senior advisor at CIC. Dr. Paris has worked in higher education for 35 years in a number of administrative and leadership roles. He served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at Hamilton College, where he oversaw a comprehensive curriculum reform, a longitudinal assessment project, several faculty development initiatives, and a significant expansion of undergraduate research. Prior to this role, he also served as Associate Dean of the Faculty and Chair of the Government Department. As a teacher and scholar, his areas of expertise are political theory and public policy, with a particular emphasis on educational policy at all levels. We would like to begin by thanking you for taking the time to talk to us today. The commitment to quality seems quite simple and even commonsensical. Set high expectations, gather evidence of effectiveness, use the evidence, and report on results. In fact, I believe nearly all faculty would indicate that they regularly do this in their own classes, minus the reporting on results. So, why, after decades of moving toward assessment, do we still seem to have trouble gaining acceptance of these actions at the program, degree, general education level? Has it been due to missteps and false starts before arriving at this point? The public nature of what is a deeply personal activity, teaching, because it is an external mandate? The fear of an NCLB for college education somewhere over the horizon? Stubbornness and fear of change? How do we move forward in a real and feasible way, both within and across institutions?
That's more than one question. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I don't get to be on TV very often. First off, thank you again, not just for having me, but for recognizing the commonsensical nature of what's in that. But I would also point out that as commonsensical as that might seem, it took almost a year to get everybody who's agreed on the words on the board of the Alliance to agree to the publication. Since the publication, we've gotten 40 different associations to endorse it. The idea being that this becomes a kind of shared community of professionals understanding, and that's what we're aiming for. So it being simple and commonsensical and consensual is part of the purpose of it, is to get widespread agreement. Why would you think that you would need widespread agreement to something that's consensual and commonsensical? Precisely because higher education is a profession that prides itself on autonomy and diversity, and teaching as what is almost a private activity. It even mentions here about the personal nature of teaching. True enough. Every professor is king or queen in his or her classroom, my course, my students. But what has evolved for the last 30 years is a commonsensical demand that there be some commitment or assurance that the work that we do with students in post-secondary education produces quality results. And so what was previously acceptable notion of academic freedom and of professional norms, where the primary act of assessment is grading me and my students in a private, highly contextualized, with the only public reporting, there is a reporting, is a grade. But there's increasing doubt that we really know what the quality is of the result if we simply look at the grades. And that's not just because of grade inflation, but because a grade's just a letter. We don't know what the grade really reflects. It reflects some overall summative judgment, but it doesn't reflect, do you write well, have you gained in critical thinking, all the things that we expect post-secondary education to do. So to the sub-questions of this general question, the main obstacle, the main trouble toward moving toward assessment more broadly understood is the fact that the way in which the profession has evolved is of each professor in his or her own box, teaching their subject because they are the experts in their subject and their authority as experts needs to be deferred to. But the demand, both on an institutional level, but more importantly on a societal level, is that somehow quality be assured. So we have to somehow balance and square, make consistent the rightful commitment to faculty members teaching as kind of as they see fit with the demand from the public and from the institution that in fact they produce good results. Those are both legitimate demands. They both need to be met. We need to do both things simultaneously. So then to the sub-questions about I just mentioned why we seem to have trouble, because actually I've taught for 30 years and I do the syllabus, I do the assessment, I choose the content, I discuss the structure, I decide how the time is spent. I am king or queen. I'm king in my class. The public nature, it can be threatening. The idea that in fact issues of quality have to be somehow publicized or assured automatically puts it into the public realm. And what was previously private is now being made public. In some way is going to automatically produce some kind of fear of abuse of evaluation judgment that's unwarranted. And those are also legitimate fears, just as the demand for quality is a legitimate demand. Because it's an external mandate. Well, yes. And the reason that external mandates have been more pressing is that accreditation agencies, under pressure from the federal government, have put more pressure to produce quality. And the federal government has put pressure on accreditation agencies because the federal government says, again, another legitimate demand, we're spending billions in higher education. We need to be assured that the stewardship of our money is sound and that we're getting results for it. So that's, again, we have a number of competing legitimate demands. Fear of NCLB for college education somewhere over the horizon. I think that's true. There probably is fear out there, but that need not be. And the best safeguard against that fear being realized is for us to produce measures or metrics or qualitative judgments that actually satisfy the legitimate demand for quality. Otherwise, the temptation to go to a simple bottom line measure like No Child Left Behind will be overwhelming, and the federal government might very well do that. The fact is, they might do it anyway, regardless of what we do. We could do everything right, and they could still do it. They have the power of the purse string. So I don't think that the fear of an NCLB thing should in any way be an impediment to actually doing assessment. It should be a spur to doing it. Stubbornness and fear of change are human nature, and therefore it's part of life. So yes, that's part of it too. How do we move forward in a real and feasible way, both within and across institutions? Well, what the Alliance is trying to do with this document is at least get agreements in principle that can lead to concrete discussions of what to do in practice. The more recent publication, Assuring Quality, is an institutional audit checklist based on the Committing to Quality principles that says, okay, now how do we get this to ground? How do these general commonsensical shared principles, and then there's a detailed checklist for self-audit that we think might help institutions take it on themselves to do this. And increasingly, institutions are doing it. and that's a good thing. I do think that if we wish to retain our autonomy, we have to really develop professional norms and routines that do this. Final point, the one analogy I'm most fond of in terms of our profession and our industry has to do with healthcare. Necessary goods, or perceived to be necessary goods, that are very costly, and the question of quality is constantly being visited. I think that we can learn a lot from the medical profession. I think the medical profession is still a long way from quality assurance and cost control, as are we. But if we think of ourselves less of, let's say, ministers with our private flocks, and more like doctors who are practicing a profession, serving our clients, we would probably be a lot better off. And if you think about what's the first thing a doctor does when you walk in the office, the vital signs, right? What's your temperature, your heart rate, whatever. We should have similar kinds of things for diagnosing and treating our clients, our students. So I can go on, and it will go on and on, but in terms of where we are with committing to quality, the idea is really to get an agreement in principle that's a little bit more than just mom and apple pie, because as a later question talks about, there's benchmarking, there's disaggregation, there's some specifics in there that actually are more than just everybody measure as they will. Although there's a great deal of latitude, obviously, in the guidelines, and they are, after all, guidelines.
All right, thank you very much. So our next question is this. In the introduction, the document mentions the need to increase the learning represented in the degree. In this statement, are you suggesting there may be a need to increase standards in higher education?
Well, not exactly. I think that it's more quality assurance than it is here's where the bar should be set. That it's more, let's have institutions be much clearer about what kind of quality they wish to produce, and be much more explicit about whether in fact they find themselves producing it. As far as setting a national standard for this level of that kind of accomplishment, we're not agnostic, but we're not putting forward any, let's say, bar or standard for what an appropriate level of achievement will be. The Lumina Foundation has put out a degree qualifications profile that it says does set such bars, but because there really isn't measurement or assessment around the particular elements of the DQP framework, they don't address that question directly either. No one does at the moment, and for the moment at least, since we don't know how we're measuring what we're measuring, it's a little early to actually say, okay, the national standard of good enough, let's say, for writing or quantitative literacy. Quantitative literacy might be a good example. What would be an appropriate level of achievement that any institution should aspire to for college level quantitative literacy? It's not available at this time. We could imagine it being available. In fact, we could imagine such benchmarks or bars being set for a lot of the particular outcomes that we might specify in higher education, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. Next question. Does suggesting that assessment be used for comparative purposes through externally informed benchmarks or direct comparisons to the evidence of effectiveness gathered by at other institutions create competition and defensiveness that is contrary to the position that higher education consists of a community of self-governed institutions, all seeking to improve ourselves?
Yeah, perhaps no issue in the putting together of these guidelines created more conversation, more disagreement, more hostility, more back and forth than the word benchmarking and the discussion of benchmarking. for just the reason that's implied in the question. Does this mean that we will have rankings? Does this mean that there will be invidious comparisons? Is it going to be competition? Are people going to fudge the figures as they, yet another university was found to have fudged its admission statistics last week in order to improve its thing in the rankings? My view of this is that, and it says in the document, that the primary purpose of comparison is improvement, not rankings. If you're going to do comparison with an eye toward improvement, some possibility of comparison, defensiveness, competition is inevitable. And let me go out on a limb, some degree of competition and comparison is healthy. So as a reference, I would suggest that people read an article that's now 6 or 7 years old by Atul Gawande, the medical writer, called The Bell Curve, in which he talked about the treatment of cystic fibrosis. And people came to realize that different clinics had different long-term survival rates. And when you look more closely, they used different techniques, there were different degrees of diligence. And what happened was the treatment of cystic fibrosis overall improved. The comparative aspects began to fall a little bit by the wayside in favor of collective professional improvement. Now, I wouldn't go too far saying, oh, that's the glorious future of academic comparison. It may not be. But I would say that thinking of it as a process of collective self-improvement that necessarily involves comparison, even if it's, and Project Vision in Massachusetts is currently working on developing measures that can be shared across categories of institutions, comparing community colleges with like community colleges. Those comparisons could lead to defensiveness. Somebody might figure out some way to try to make our rankings out of it. I would hope not. I would hope they would simply look at it as, here's information that can help all of us improve on what we do. That is, create a professional community. I mean, is what doctors think about first thing out the chute. How do I compete with my fellow doctor? I certainly hope not. I hope that what they think about in the cystic fibrosis clinic is, how do we make our patients better? And that if we think that way and carry that through, I think that the fear of U.S. News style rankings is probably overblown. Actually, I have more of a fear that somebody's going to try to invent, and lots of people are out there trying to invent rankings so they can compete with U.S. News, which is such a rich market, that they might try to invent some kind of ranking system around outcomes somehow defined that would really be some distance from what we as a professional community would want to define as outcomes. Oh, one final thing. Self-governance is perfectly consistent with comparison. That is, no one would say to a doctor, you're not an autonomous professional. You prescribe, you decide what the diagnosis is, you decide what the treatment is, but supposedly it's consistent within a professional framework that says here's what good standards of care are.
So the next question. In the set ambitious goals section, the document implies there should be a tie between academic and co-curricular activities in meeting institutional learning goals. It seems this may be a missing link in higher education. Do you see evidence that this is beginning to change? Do you think it is okay to align academic and co-curricular activities separately, or would this be best done in an integrated manner?
Well, I would think that, well, first off, I think that the industry has come a long way both about assessment generally. That is, it's now less whether we do it, but in fact how we do it. And I think that the same can be said of the academic co-curricular relationship, that increasingly people are realizing, and it's a natural realization as they look more at student learning and they talk to students and have students report. Some of my most transformative experiences occurred in the co-curricular setting, and there's a lot of George Koo, Richard Keeling, there's a lot of documentation of this. I think it's, just to borrow the phrasing of the question, I think it's okay if they're aligned separately. I think it's better if they're integrated. I think it's better that we do something in both areas, move forward, and I think the integration, which I doubt will ever be complete, and I think that's okay too, but that the integration will come in due course, particularly as in the conversation of DePaul's goals increasingly, they're talking about university goals that cut across curricular and co-curricular. In our work, I've been pleasantly surprised. There have been several institutions that we've worked with where someone said, well, gee, we don't meet your guidelines because we don't assess co-curricular goals. And we would ask them back, well, have you talked to the co-curricular, the student affairs or whatever you call it, about what they're doing by way of assessment? Get a call back in fairly short order that in fact the co-curricular side is way ahead in doing this kind of work, for reasons that go back to the first question about autonomy, and individual autonomy and private activity and so on. So I actually am quite optimistic about both assessment in the co-curricular realm and the prospects for integration with the academic realm.
How do you recommend promoting students' awareness of the connection between coursework and co-curricular experiences in meeting institutional learning goals?
Well, I think that the way to do it is something that students are always asking for, actually. It's the worst version of what students are asking for is, will that be on the test, right? Does this matter? The best version is if a faculty member says, here are the criteria for evaluation, here's what I want the outcomes to be for you. Once that conversation occurs, then the students are enlisted in the process, and lo and behold, they might actually do better work because they know what's expected of them. Most of the time, in my long years of teaching, I found the clearer I make the expectations, the better results I get from the students, because they want to do well, even if it's for the most mundane goals of getting a good grade. They're more likely to see the value of what the work is, the relevance of it, why they should invest their time and energy, if in fact you can make clear to them what the results are that you're looking for and what the expectations are that you're setting. And so I think the best thing we could do in this book, Academically Adrift, that was published a couple years ago, that talked about students' disengagement and how they are, quote, adrift. One of the reasons students are adrift, if you talk to them, is they don't know what it means. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing in a given course, let's say. And the more we can enlist them in the process, I think the better off we are. NALOA's survey a couple years ago, something like 75% of the academic administrators and some large portion of the faculty were aware that there were institutional goals and could tell you in some rough and ready way what those goals were. Students? No, hardly all. But, what are the institutional learning goals? I mean, if we asked a student, any given student walking on the path on the campus, what are the outcomes that are supposed to occur when you're all done? I get a degree, I get a job, as opposed to the specific learning goals. So yeah, I think actually almost as much as promoting faculty awareness of it being explicit about outcomes is the value of getting students to be aware and participate in the discussion of them. And it would make student work and grading, I mean, just a simple use of a rubric in grading would probably have beneficial effects for students, and it would probably get rid of the typical student reaction that grading is this subjective, arbitrary process where it's whether the professor likes me or likes my work.
In the Gather Evidence section, the document provides a number of guidelines that seem more directly applicable to academic programs and co-curricular programs. What are your recommendations for co-curricular programs, particularly with regard to the ability to compare evidence to external sources, benchmarks, and measuring levels of student engagement in programs.
Yeah, I plead guilty to the academic tilt and bias in committing to quality, and I think I don't want to say it's exactly inevitable, but I think it reflects what the state of play at most colleges and universities. With regard to comparing evidence, that's a matter of to external sources. That kind of benchmarking depends on what kind of measures we're talking about, and whether there's something akin to NSSE, the National Survey for Student Engagement, that applies to co-curricular activities. I know is it the Council or the Committee of Academic CAS?
Yeah.
Has standards that would probably produce the ability to benchmark or compare to external sources. So I think it's all possible. Whether it's as far along, I'm not sure. We're all at different levels of progress. And again, the question of levels of engagement, it may be a more complicated instrument that might be involved, or instruments that might be involved, but we could imagine. And I believe, I'm not sure whether George Q's high impact practices document might not have a student affairs dimension in it that would lend itself to the possibility of benchmarking, because now with his particular practices, you probably can do a survey of a student's transcript or record and figure out what the exposure was to those. Likewise, I could imagine a similar kind of evaluation being done on the student affairs side of the house. Of course, with the big caveat that you might for example, he says a first year program or first year experience. Having one is probably better than not having one. Having a bad one probably is not a whole lot better than not having one, right? So it's that these programs get carried out in an intentional and thorough way.
The next question is, what recommendations do you have for integrating co-curriculum in the academic program review process?
Well, I think the co-curriculum should have a parallel model of program review. I don't think that academic program review is exactly, at least my experience with it, is not been done in a compelling way. That is, many program reviews in academic program reviews, you bring in an external committee, there's a self-study. It's sort of a miniature accreditation review, but it often does not include real measures of academic progress or anything. It's really the faculty's impressions of itself and the external review team's impressions of the faculty's impressions. And so that's all, well, that's the point, as opposed to evidence. So that I would be careful for what you wish for if you want to integrate the co-curriculum in the academic program review process, but would think that to the degree that either academic or co-curricular programs set up their outcomes and their metrics, then you can begin to talk around evidence as opposed to around impressions. And the more you talk around the evidence, the more you have to think about what the narrative is that fits the evidence. That is, we can get evidence and we can say, well, really, not many students are participating in these kind of co-curricular programs. Having that data doesn't necessarily tell you the story of why. And so one of the things that I always recommend is make sure you retain robust qualitative evaluation processes. Have focus groups. Talk to students. It's remarkable talking to students. They usually have a very savvy sense of what's going on, and they whatever else they know how they feel about something, and are quite happy to share it with you and why, and usually have a pretty good sense of what's going on in the dynamic with the institution. So I would say, I think academic program review, one other thing about academic program review, and that is that besides evidence of student learning, there's also something there might be broader indicators of performance with regard to academic programs. So a pre-professional program, obviously job placement would be such an indicator. You would wonder whether there were certain parallel indicators for co-curricular programs.
So the next, do you see the purpose of gathering evidence of student learning being different for accountability versus assessment? Or do you see these concepts as inextricably intertwined?
I see them as connected but in tension, and it's a sort of a classic. There was an article Peter Ewell wrote for the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment a couple years ago that said he wrote an article about this relationship in 1987 and he could still write the same article. So that I think that what you see is that accountability typically is for a different purpose. It requires somewhat different kinds of metrics, but these things are connected. That is, if we were doing assessments for improvement that had no connection at all to what we might report out, that would be a strange situation. And if we were simply doing measures to do some, and I think this is one of the limitations of things like the collegiate learning assessment, we might know at the end of 4 years that our students have not advanced on the CLA. And then what? Right? What do we do with that fact? Which is why all the other kinds of assessments have to be in play. They have to be in place. The connection between the two, there is some connection, but it isn't tight and it isn't linear, and there's often a tension between them. So someone might say, well, you've done all these assessments on the ground, but your students still score lousy on the CLA. Well, then we have to talk about that. There isn't an automatic narrative that says, you might say, well, the CLA isn't that great an instrument. Or you might say, it's a really great instrument and maybe we should think of aligning our assessments so that they actually produce the results. And I've seen both discussions on campuses where, in fact, they did a lot as a result of CLA results. Or they simply said, well, that's very interesting. Let's go on to talk about what we really want to do, which is assess at the ground level our courses and our enrichment students, which are both prima facie legitimate responses to the issue. So I think that there's always going to be a tension just because these are different activities. When we account to somebody, we're doing something that's a little bit different than when we're doing the sort of more fine-grained assessment for improvement. Accountability, they're somewhat different exercises. So I would say they're related but not inextricably intertwined. And I do think that people get scared off of assessment because they fear that it automatically leads to you will be examined and found wanting kind of accountability, which is really not its purpose. Assessment should be primarily first and foremost, and almost always, not always, but almost always for improvement. The doctor's examples I used earlier is that we wouldn't use these statistics about, say, survivability rates in different clinics in order to punish the clinics. The point is to improve the clinics so that everybody gets better. And that's part of the point of the discussion that I had earlier of medical statistics.
The next question is, committing to quality recommends using uniform definitions and reporting conventions in reporting evidence and results of student learning. Do you think this may cause a problem by limiting the variability of assessment models and assessment methods, given that the most appropriate models and methods may be different based on the variability of the associated programs?
Well, this is a tough one because I don't think we said that. I mean, I don't think we said that it recommends using uniform definitions and reporting conventions. I think within the institution, I think if I can make sense of the question is only sensible to me if it says uniform definitions within an institution. So there will be institutional outcomes that have some definition. Now, uniform reporting conventions, I don't see that that's even logically possible. So critical thinking might mean something in one discipline and a different metric in one discipline than it is in another. Quantitative literacy might mean something else again. So I think that one of the things that I thought we were doing with committing to quality was acknowledging the variability in institutions, missions, and their possible statements of outcomes within some very, very broad parameters. That is, if the institution's outcomes are achievement of high school level algebra, we know that there's something wrong with that. And whether it's uniformly defined or not, that's not an appropriate college level outcome. So in the footnotes, which I remember also were a subject of controversy, was who to point to as providing uniform or possible broad definitions. So we pointed to the AAC&U, and we pointed to Lumina's DQP profile as examples, not as everybody should adopt the Lumina degree qualifications profile. In fact, one of the debates, not to get too inside baseball here, but one of the debates was, well, if you put it in a footnote, you're recommending it. No, it's an example. We're not recommending it. If you want to use it, fine. If you don't, fine. And there are going to be institutions that have different tilts in their missions and are going to emphasize different outcomes in different ways. So we were just pointing to common frameworks that had been published that suggested. So AAC&U's LEAP framework is an example, and in fact, DePaul's goals seem quite in line with AAC&U's, but they're not the same. So the uniformity isn't there, but I wouldn't say, oh no, this violates community equality because it doesn't conform to some uniform definition of outcomes or reporting. Quite the contrary. Now, what one might but one might imagine as a possibility is people talk about this more publicly and they report evidence more publicly, that there will be some gravitation towards certain ways of framing issues, which the LEAP has already had an impact on, and the ways of measuring things, that people might find these kinds of measures more congenial than these kinds of measures. And that's just the natural evolution of a profession. That people will do things that they think by their best professional judgment that this is the way we can best serve our clients. And then that either shrinking or growing of variability is just part of professional evolution. But we were not in any way in this document trying to shrink at all the definitions and reporting conventions available to people.
The final question, what are your thoughts on the proliferation, I can say the word, of online learning both at the campus level and MOOCs?
MOOCs.
Which comes up a lot. Particularly the regulation of quality in both online courses and degrees, especially in light of the level of access that online courses can provide to traditionally underrepresented populations.
Mm-hmm. I think actually the development of MOOCs and the expansion of online learning opportunities actually accelerates the need for guidelines like this, because otherwise we won't know what's happening. I think it's actually, we overstate our understanding of what's happening when we assess on a campus, and we understate our knowledge of what's happening when somebody goes in an online environment. That is, it is really the same question of assessment and what are the learning outcomes and what evidence do you have that they're being achieved. The argument, I think, for MOOCs, but particularly in the online learning environment, and I've seen some examples of this in some of the online providers, is that they can provide I want to be careful here, but a more thorough, consistent, coherent documentation of the evidence and evaluation of student achievement. That's the claim. Whether they actually can carry out that claim is another matter. MOOCs, I think, share in that, or potentially share in that, but I think at the moment MOOCs are, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a novelty still. We don't know how well they work. We do know a couple things about them. They're free. You can take a course. You can complete a course, and presumably if you complete a course just as you complete a course in an online environment, well, if it is an online environment, then you've completed the course. What did you achieve? Well, you might have achieved accomplishing certain tasks just as you would in a classroom environment. I took the test, I passed the test. I turned in the project or whatever it is. So we still don't know what it all means. And we still don't know, for example, whether people are prepared to accept completion in a MOOC environment as a credit. So even, so you take Stanford, they put the big MOOC out there with a lot of noise, taught by a Stanford professor, presumably got Stanford course content. Where's the credit? Well, if you're giving away a Stanford credit for free while you're charging the on-campus, there's going to be a lot of questions about the market and the buying and selling of educational credentials in the near future that are going to be really thorny. And I'm not going so far as to talk the language of disruptive innovation, which is all what everybody's at Twitter about, because I think these things move a little slower than we expect, but they do move. The whole online environment, I think, just raises the ante on the question of assessment about evidence of student learning. So, and most of the literature to this point has basically said, well, students can learn in an online environment and they can learn in a classroom, and if there's any winner so far in the research, and the research is still, like most research, it kind of goes along, blended is somehow superior, which makes a whole lot of sense, is that there's different kinds of engagement, and the engagement of online mixed with the engagement of personal coaching makes a good deal of sense that at least initially that evidence would indicate. Now, is that going to continue? I don't know. But I do think that what it does also with regard to regulation of quality is a very knotty question, because so far the regulatory attempts on the part of the government are, I would not, trying to regulate them in terms of credit hours is a misadventure when what we're looking for is outcomes. How you do it, that doesn't mean I know how to do it. I can't blame the government for wanting to regulate such that there's a certain minimum level of rigor in an online course. I think I understand the impulse. I don't know that the instrument is the effective way to do it, I guess is what I'm saying. But the same questions, and this is going to happen, the same questions are going to start being asked. Yes, we can say that our students sit in their seats for a certain number of hours, so they should get the credit hours, but that isn't the regulation of quality. That's the regulation of seat time, right? It's the regulation of how much time you spend in the chair. So I do think that MOOCs and online learning both present interesting challenges both to the nature of educational credentials, the market for them, but above all, and this is obviously my interest and my bias, they do present the question of quality in a more dramatic way to all of us in higher education, particularly those of us that are working in traditional settings.
Thank you.